Hey there, and welcome back to another edition of Chicago Crossing Model Railroad. Eric here with you. Today's another edition of Train Talk. And I wanted to follow up on the last video I did, which was talking about the fine-scale modeler's dilemma. And what came up in that is basically, how deep can one go in terms of detail? How deep should one go? And what are some of the limitations involved in trying to model fine details, especially in a small scale like N scale, like this? A very nested question that comes with that fine scale modeler's dilemma is actually simply the model railroader's dilemma, which is, when is a layout actually finished? So I wanted to talk with you today about that topic, and also to provide a little bit of a channel update. I thought I would do that first. First off, when I started this channel back at the tail end of 2022 and put up the first layout tour, I had no idea how much people would respond to a tiny little loop style layout such as this. And I've been amazed ever since. Chicago Crossing grew within a relatively short time to now have over 4,400 subscribers. And so I wanted to, first off, acknowledge everybody who's supported this channel, and to, say thank you for all of the kind comments and all of the interesting comments. YouTube, much like any social media outlet, can be a peanut gallery of people who just heckle and troll and say all sorts of gnarly things to each other. And, I've been pleasantly surprised. Chicago Crossing Model Railroad welcomes comments. I respond to comments I get that stay on topic, and 99.8% of comments that show up on my comment feed are from people in the community who enjoy model trains, who enjoy the layout, who are curious, who have questions, and who have advice. The comments are positive, they're helpful, insightful, and that's great. This is a really fun way to engage with an international community of model railroaders. And I've got to say, I've become a hell of a lot smarter just by interacting with you. So if you've left a comment before and we've met through that medium, hey, thank you for dropping by. And I always look forward to hearing from you. There are some folks I hear from a lot, and some folks who I've gotten to know, and that's really awesome. So another topic just to mention, because this kind of falls into the channel as a whole, one thing you probably notice is, relative to some model railroad channels, the production schedule for Chicago Crossing is always a bit sporadic. There are some months where you'll see 3 or 4 new pieces of content put out for your enjoyment. In other cases, you won't see that many. Sometimes you'll see none. I'm right at the peak of my career currently. I have a full-time occupation, actually more than full-time occupation, as a scientist. I work at a major research institution here in the Mountain West, and so there usually is not a lot of time to produce content. And my goal is to ensure that what I create for you and what I share with you is actually worth your time. So bear with me. With all that in mind, I think it's time to really hit the major topic here. And as I mentioned, that topic is, when is the layout actually done? And with that in mind, what is the future for CCMR, for Chicago Crossing Model Railroad? I think the adage that all of us in the modeling community hear, and some of us say, the sort of pet answer is, a model railroad layout is never really finished. There's always something new to do, right? And, it's true. The list for Chicago Crossing Model Railroad is probably a mile long. But if we come back to the fundamental question that I think the model railroad world wrestles with as we build layouts and then decide when we're done, is it's less about whether the layout itself is done or finished. It's more, are we done or finished with the layout? In other words, at what point do we get to where the layout really doesn't have anything specific to offer us anymore as modelers, and it either doesn't challenge us or doesn't provide operation interest? You kind of use it all up. Some folks will build up a layout, and I've seen this. They'll build it up. Sometimes it's a weirdly complex spaghetti bowl. Sometimes it gets half finished. Sometimes it's actually sort of finished to a decent standard. And within about a year or two, they tear it back down, get started again. It's kind of this punctuated equilibrium of building and destroying and building and destroying and things like that. A lot of those layouts, use stuff like Kato Unitrack, which actually lends itself really well to being able to rearrange and recycle track. You've got integrated roadbed, everything clips together tightly. And that's sort of an interesting innovation because, layouts like this that use traditional flex track, ripping out track and replacing it is not exactly a trivial exercise. And so, sometimes what you end up seeing is, somebody builds something that's like a half plywood Pacific and maybe the scenicking is partially done, and then they're like, I think I've gotten what I want out of it. Time to tear it all down and do it again. I think the opportunity to change things up is compelling for some folks if their focus is operations, especially when you want to be able to vary where your trains go and how they get there, or to modify operations easily to improve them. Chicago Crossing is a really nice operating layout. I can't say I operated a ton. Mostly I spend my time scenicking it or building it. But once you've operated for a while, you sort of play out all those combinations. And, Chicago Crossing might get to that point relatively quickly. I've run every conceivable type of train down every conceivable track here. There's still opportunities to mix things up. I've never actually run a formalized sort of operating session where I'm really trying to get a car into a specific place or make the locomotives do work. So, there's still some to come. But, then on the other end of the spectrum, and I think this is probably where my layout ends up fitting, is these layouts that exist for decades or more, or years and years. And, in some cases, it just takes time for somebody to build it out. Others are probably people like me, just don't have a lot of time to work on the layout versus other things going on in our lives. And I also suspect a lot of those layouts, just from my own survey of YouTube, they're big layouts, and sometimes they're layouts that have multiple contributors to them. Sometimes they're layouts that somebody has basically been working on that takes up an entire basement for, something like 20 years. How somebody hangs onto a small 3x7 for this amount of time, if I had a lot of time on my hands, I don't know that I'd still be working with Chicago Crossing or not. The reason that this layout is so satisfying is because I don't have to, commit to the big build anymore. I can really just refine and use this as a laboratory, like I mentioned. And that's, I think, where, the rationale for me for hanging on to this layout has been so long, is I treat this as an artwork. And in some ways, the trains are not necessarily secondary to it. They provide the animation and they provide the rationale for building this thing. But I could sweep off all of the locomotives and cars from this layout and scenic it for the next 6 months and not run a single train, and I would be just as immersed in this layout as if the trains were actually running all the time. So the idea of the slow motion artwork is much more my style. But the big question that I have been wrestling with more recently, especially as this layout gets more and more consistent with my ultimate vision for it, is how long can you really sustain the level of immersion on a 3x7 layout to justify its continuing to work on it? How long until the next modification or evolution I make in a scene or a diorama starts to have a diminishing return, both on the way the layout looks or on the way it operates? Back when I made Train Talk Volume 2, I had discussed some of the imperfections that I perceived on Chicago Crossing Model Railroad that can impact operations and prototypicality. I've put the link up here so you can see it. So things like how the crossovers are arranged, they're kind of too short, or the tunnels and the bluffs, which don't exist in Chicago necessarily. Those are, elements that are aprototypical, but they're also really big projects. To take the tunnel over here on the left, to rip it out, and then to replace it with something that looks as good or better. And that's really the criteria for me. It can't look like crap. It's got to look as good or better. To take out the crossovers or replace them or remove them, and to rewire them. This is really not trivial stuff. This is a small layout. It's easy to just get work dust everywhere. It's easy to damage areas that are already finished, and that's the thing. This layout, in many areas, including close to the areas I'm talking about, is essentially done. And, rewiring track and essentially digging through the archaeological dig of all of the wiring and trying to redo things, that is not a small project. And it would make the layout look better. There's no doubt about it. I think I can easily get any of those things done to look at least at the standard of where they are. And so it would look great with the left side here being an embankment with trackage from another railroad going over, like a flyover. There's a lot of those in Chicago. On the right-hand side, modeling the Illinois-Indiana Skyway would be a great way to cover up that track and be able to replace the tunnel, or at least, change the way it looks over there. But yeah, is it worth it to rip those things out, potentially damage other things, create the dust, and sort of definish what otherwise looks like a nicely finished layout? Man, that is something I've not decided upon. And the other thing is, a lot of people who watch content from this channel, they're people who have lived in the parts of Chicago that I model. And they comment in the comments below, and they say, Eric, this layout reminds me of where I grew up. This layout looks like where I lived. I get it. And you would make an argument easily that if somebody actually gets the premise of the layout, they know what you're modeling, and they see it and they feel it intuitively, that sparks that kind of reaction. I don't know whether that makes it worthwhile to rip something out that people just kind of ignore. And so I think for me, the dilemma now, and the bigger dilemma besides just how do I model the next garbage bag, is does it actually make sense to keep the slow motion art project with Chicago Crossing going? If the mission is to create a scene that people react to and they say, that is Chicago, that's where I grew up, that's where I lived, I know that, probably not. 8 years in running is a long time for a 3x7 layout. I would argue that only about maybe 30% of the scenery that you see on here was actually here and looked this way back even in 2019. This layout has been extensively refined. And so, there may not really be a lot more to do. You saw the list. Sure, I can scratch build Finkel steel, and I could weather this other building to a deeper standard to make it look dirtier, and all those sorts of things. But do I really want to? And as opposed to maybe just start with a clean slate with all of the experience I've gained and try to do something different or better. And that's actually been kind of a compelling argument for me, because I have the space for a shelf layout. If you look around the train room here, there's a bunch of stuff sitting on this ledge, but where this ledge is and how this room is arranged is absolutely optimal for building a shelf layout. And I've been in the midst of planning what that layout looks like. My inspiration is to, use layouts like the Kingsbury branch, and to expand upon that idea and to model and explore Goose Island in the 80s and 90s Basically modeling the old Milwaukee Road or Chicago Terminal Railroad, depending on what era you're talking about. I think Soo Line and Canadian National also ran that trackage. That stuff on Goose Island, it's what served Finkel Steel. It served Big Bay Lumber. It served Peerless Confections, National Byproducts. It connected with Morton Salt. It connected with the Union Pacific yard, and that's where the interchange space was. All of that stuff would just be a phenomenal area to model that fits with what I really love about railroads. It would be a deeper dive into something which you kind of get on the left side of this layout here. This left side sort of glosses the idea or is loosely inspired by the area on the near north side or on Goose Island. This would be an opportunity to make a layout that has improved operability than what's here, better runarounds, a lot of single track line that offers for great scenery, scratch-built bridges, buildings, code 55 track, you name it. Like, there's a lot that I could do on a new layout that would essentially move beyond the restrictions that this particular layout has. The issue is, that's a huge investment in time and energy. So I have to be careful to scale my ambitions, and I think we all do. You've got to scale your ambitions to your time and energy allotment for a railroad, I think, in order to feel satisfied by it, and how much time and energy you need to get to what you see as the vision. And so I've been starting to think a little bit about, how do I scratch the itch about starting over, starting something new, and being able to use the skills I have from the ground up, as opposed to trying to continue to overlay something on a railroad like this. And so I've been considering taking a page from the British modelers. A lot of these individuals build fairly small, almost what I would call switching dioramas within the small spaces if they're living in a small flat or something like that. And those are really compelling because you can operate, but you also can take a deep dive into the details and the scenery. And I think for modeling the type of railroading that occurred on Goose Island in the 80s and 90s, developing something like a 1x3 switching module or switching diorama might actually be the way to sort of scratch the itch of starting something new without having to commit to a giant plywood base that stretches over all three sides of this room, and that is going to take years and years in order to build out. One thing I should say, though, is I don't have plans to stop working on Chicago Crossing Model Railroad as you see it here. Regardless of whether or not I start working on a module and start sharing that process with you, I am not going to be dismantling this layout. I'm not going to be selling it. I'm not going to be moving it into a dusty attic or garage. I don't need to. Building a module or even a shelf layout is perfectly consistent with having this thing around, maybe just in a different spot in the basement is all. And so this layout won't go anywhere. So I think, it's important to keep an open mind and, to honor one's own instincts as to where they are in the hobby, so that it stays fresh and it stays interesting and exciting. I think the world of should. I should finish this layout. I should do this one thing. I should do this other thing. Man, we live in enough should, I think, in our lives to where can, could, might is appropriate for a hobby. So I guess, the end of this is, if we come back to the question, when is the layout done? I think it really depends on when you feel your layout's done, and when you find that you've gotten what you want out of it and that it's time to move on. I think for a lot of different people, that's a really distinct set of questions. So with that, I hope you have a great weekend. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time on The Layout.